In September 2024, the Associated Press reported that Argentinian prosecutors were launching a criminal investigation into the Catholic organization Opus Dei. According to the report, prosecutors asked a federal judge to summon Opus Dei leaders from several South American nations to testify in the matter of alleged cases of human trafficking and labor exploitation against at least 44 women between the early 1970s and 2015.
According to the report that concluded the investigation, they found that people holding different positions within Opus Dei established a structure dedicated to recruiting at least 44 women, most of them girls and adolescents, to be subjected to living conditions comparable to servitude. They argue that the organization took girls from low-income families in rural areas and recruited them under the guise of receiving job training. Meanwhile, some of the women involved reported to the AP that they were working under conditions that included working without pay for more than 12 hours without breaks, except for food or prayer and other violations of basic rights. Opus Dei leadership, meanwhile, categorically denies the allegations against them. According to the prelature of Opus Dei in Argentina, critics have concocted the accusations by taking details out of context.
Welcome to Glad You Asked, where we answer the questions about Catholicism that are easy to ask, but not so easy to answer. Opus Dei, which is Latin for Work of God, is a highly respected and influential group with a global reach. It is estimated that there are around 90,000 members located in 70 countries. Members include priests and religious, but also laypeople who work ordinary jobs. Many of these people are unaware of the investigations into Opus Dei and find participation in the organization aids their spirituality and relationship with God.
Opus Dei was founded nearly a century ago by a Spanish priest named Josemaría Escrivá, with the goal of offering ordinary people a way to achieve sanctity in everyday life. According to the Opus Dei website, Escriva had a vision of people of every nation and race, of every age and culture, seeking and finding God right in the middle of their ordinary life, their work, their family, their friendships. People who looked for Jesus in order to love him and to live his holy life until they were completely transformed and made into saints. Pope St. John Paul II was an admirer of Escriva and canonized him in 2002.
So, how do we balance the allegations and other scandals with the inclusive church Escriva saw in his vision? What exactly is Opus Dei, and what is its relation to the rest of the church? That's what we're discussing on this episode of Glad You Asked. Well, I think we should take a step back before we dive into the drama of Opus Dei, because I have heard that you were once recruited.
I was, yes, briefly because I was getting a graduate degree in philosophy at a Catholic school. I guess I mistakenly gave the impression of a person who would have been a good fit. Um, Even though my family was very kind of countercultural, we were not like ordinary, everyday professional Catholics. We lived off grid. So, yeah, they were very nice people. They invited me to their get together. I looked around, I saw a bunch of suits. I thought, this is not for me. I conversed a bit, and they thought, no, she's not for us either.
And I think, as we were preparing for this interview and as we were talking to our guest, we kind of realized how much we don't know about Opus Dei, and that while Opus Dei is an organization that has been extremely meaningful to a lot of people, there's also just a lot of secrecy surrounding it. So today's guest is going to help clarify some of this. I'm Emily Santa, one of your hosts for the Glad You Asked podcast.
And I'm Rebecca Bratton Weiss. Before we get into the interview, though, let's take a moment to thank our sponsors.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The USA-Canada province of the Claretian Missionaries tends to the religious and pastoral needs of vulnerable communities. As part of a global congregation of Catholic priests and brothers, Claretians uplift the dignity of all people, especially those who feel overlooked or forgotten. To find out more and get involved, please visit www.claretians.org. Now back to our question of the day. What is Opus Dei?
Today we're going to be talking to the man who wrote the literal book on Opus Dei. Gareth Gore is the author of Opus, The Cult of Dark Money, human trafficking, and right wing conspiracy inside the Catholic Church.
He's a London based investigative reporter with close to 2 decades of experience. He's reported from over 25 countries and covered some of the biggest financial stories in recent years.
In the following conversation, we talked to Gore about the reporting that led to his book and asked him questions about what exactly Opus Dei is and how it functions. For more information about the book or our review of it, check out this week's show notes on the U.S. Catholic website. So, Gareth, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to dig into the ins and outs of Opus Dei.
Um, Rebecca and Emily, thank you so much for having me on the show. Greetings from London. Looking forward to the chat.
So, to start out with, for our listeners who are less versed in the intricacies of Catholic stuff, what is Opus Dei? Is it a religious order like Benedictines or Franciscans? Are people likely to encounter Opus Dei in their ordinary lives going to Catholic churches?
Okay, boiled down to its kind of core essence, Opus Dei is an officially sanctioned wing of the Catholic Church. It currently boasts about 100,000 members around the world. About half of those people are here in Europe, but it operates in around about 70 countries around the world, including the United States, where it currently has, and these numbers kind of, we don't know how accurate these are, but we think roughly there are about 3,000 Opus Dei members in the US. They are predominantly concentrated around Washington, D.C., and we can get into why that might be so, maybe perhaps a little bit later in the conversation. Okay, but these are all people who ascribe to the teachings of the Opus Dei founder, this Spanish priest called Josemaría Escrivá. And he very much set up Opus Dei in opposition to the kind of traditional religious orders. So his whole philosophy was that ordinary Catholics could aspire to they could strive for holiness in their ordinary lives by simply striving for perfection in everything they did. So he said that they were apostles in the middle of the world. So basically, by being a great teacher or a great journalist or a great engineer or a great doctor, that was a way of serving God. Very much kind of in opposition to the traditional orders were to serve God more fully. You basically had to become a priest or a monk or a nun or whatever. So this was kind of quite, I guess, revolutionary and transformational. But despite its kind of rather kind of benign and quite laudable philosophy, this is also an organization that, from its very beginning, has been kind of mired in controversy. All kinds of allegations of psychological and spiritual abuse, targeting of children, manipulation and coercion of members. And, actually more recently, there have been formal allegations in Argentina and other places of human trafficking. And yeah, again, perhaps we can get into that a little bit more later, a bit later on. But yeah, that's kind of how I would sum up this organization.
Could you just talk to us a little bit more about Escriva? What was his background? What was he like as a person?
Yeah, so Escriva was born in northern Spain in kind of just after the turn of the century, and he went to the seminary when he was still quite young and became a priest in his early 20s. He then went off to live in Madrid, and his idea was that he would do a law degree. He was a guy that he had ambition, but I think it's fair to say that his mother also piled a huge amount of pressure on him. So his father had run a business when he and his siblings were little. They went bankrupt, and so this once great life that they led, suddenly fell away. And I think the Escriva family, in the years after, they longed for this great existence that they once had. And Escriva, Jose Maria, as the eldest son, he kind of, I guess, he carried the weight of this, especially after his father died when he was still young. And so he became a priest. Um, but again, he was always juggling, his aspirations for himself, and also this pressure to provide for the family as well. And so he studied law. whilst he was still practicing as a priest. And then one day, when he was on retreat in October 1928, this is according to what he told people afterwards, he received this vision from God for this new organization, Opus Dei, which translates in Latin as the work of God, um, for a way for ordinary Catholics to better serve God through this, this philosophy that we were discussing just earlier of simply striving for perfection in all they did. But he very much failed to really recruit to this new movement in the early years. In the first kind of 5 years after initially receiving this vision from God, and writing basically what Opus Dei was, he barely managed to get any recruits at all, and he was quite despondent. At one stage, he toyed with giving up the priesthood entirely and just becoming a civil servant. I guess this pressure again to provide for the family, and also it's important to understand the backdrop to all of this as well. So this is Spain in the early 1930s. This is a country that's deeply divided, on the cusp of civil war. So you have the workers rising up. They overthrow the monarchy. They're demanding new rights for themselves. And critically for this story, they're beginning to turn their backs on the church. So they're beginning to ask questions about the role the church plays in society, why it's so involved in education, and why it seems to have this hold over the way that people think about themselves. And Escriva sees this and he's horrified. So he very much disagrees with all this kind of, not quite revolution, because, well, I guess it is a revolution. The monarchy's kind of overthrown, but he's kind of he's uncomfortable with all of this progressivism that's happening around him, and he starts to redefine Opus Dei. So he takes this quite benign philosophy of just striving for perfection, doing your best, and serving God in that way, and he starts to make it quite clear that Opus Dei is a political organization, and that he's recruiting this hidden militia that will insert itself into every element of society and use members should use their positions in society to basically fight back. And it's a fight against the progressives. It's this it's this deeply political reactionary force.
Looking at the kind of this shift that Opus Dei went through, on one hand, it looks like it's a really great idea. It's kind of in line with Vatican II that was going to come along eventually. It's almost like a populist idea. And yet you're saying that they shifted away from being I don't know, everyone can be holy. Would you say that they were opposing things like, say, equality and workers' rights and all of these movements that Escriva would have viewed as progressive?
I would kind of disagree with it being a populist movement. I think it was very much an elitist movement. So right from the so in the early 1930s, when Escriva kind of rethinks this whole idea, which is kind of ironic because in 1928 he said that he gets this vision directly from God, and God basically gives him the entire vision for Opus Dei, and he writes it all down in meticulous detail. And then 5 years later, he kind of revises a lot of those ideas. So already he's kind of raising questions about, just a minute, wasn't this supposed to be a fully formed vision directly from God? Like, how are you tweaking it and kind of refining it? How does that work? But from the early 1930s, it's quite clear that this is an elitist organization. So he stipulates that members should come from elite parts of society. So the people who are best positioned to push back on this progressive agenda, the people who are best positioned to shape society. So he comes up, with all of these requirements for membership, and these are kind of effectively still in place today. That people have to be educated to a certain level. They have to come from good Catholic families. This isn't unlike the rest of the Catholic Church, which is basically open to anybody. Opus Dei is very much a an organization that is by invite only, and you can't just go onto the Opus Dei website, punch in your details, and get a kind of pack in the post which tells you how to become a member. they decide who becomes members by, they go out, they send their local networks out to basically hunt for members. They hunt for the right kinds of members. And this kind of, has its origins very much back in Escriva's writings of the early 1930s. So it's kind of anti-populist. It's very elitist. And, your question about kind of specific policies or, specific kind of ways to see the world, I think they've always tended to recruit from kind of conservatively minded people, politically conservatively minded people, and kind of societally conservatively minded people as well. Because, like I said before, it's a reactionary group, and so I don't think it's necessary for Opus Dei to go out there and say, "This is what you should be thinking about women's rights," or "This is what you should be thinking about income distribution," or whatever. I think it's kind of, they target the people that already think the things that, I guess form, the Opus Dei mentality almost.
So, how is Opus Dei organized? Are there different kind of like types of membership? Is someone in charge? Is the organization under the control of a bishop?
So since the early 80s, John Paul II was an enormous fan of Opus Dei. So they very much kind of groomed him, for want of a better word, during the 60s and 70s when he was, this Polish priest and then archbishop, kind of wandering around Rome with not many contacts. They very much kind of got their claws into him, and they promoted his writings, published books, and invited him to all kinds of conferences. So well before he became pope, they were, trying to foster a very good relationship with him. They saw him as an up and coming star in the church, and it worked. It really paid dividends. So when he became pope, very quickly afterwards, he granted them this special status that they'd been coveting for, the previous 20 years. They'd lobbied Paul VI, and they'd lobbied John Paul I very unsuccessfully for this new status, this status that had been created in part of the Second Vatican Council, called a personal prelature. And so they were the very first personal prelature to be created by the church, and to this date remain the only personal prelature ever created by the church as well. And what that did was allow Opus Dei to operate outside of the normal hierarchy of the church. So it was like I said before, it operates in about 70 countries around the world today, but in no country whatsoever does it ever report to the local bishop or archbishop. It reports only to the Pope. And what that's done over the years is give it an incredible amount of kind of freedom and flexibility, but it's also allowed it to operate outside the usual kind of system of control and oversight. So all kinds of abuses and transgressions have been allowed to kind of fester because the local bishops and archbishops have absolutely zero jurisdiction over Opus Dei. Now, Pope Francis is beginning to address that and change that. He's very much aware of how the system has allowed Opus Dei to almost get out of control. But yeah, they basically operate outside of the normal hierarchy of the church. Now, how it kind of operates at local level, I think it's quite handy to think of Opus Dei as a kind of network of local cells that kind of operate at the local level. So you have these celibate members, they're called numeries, who have basically dedicated their lives to Opus Dei, and they run the kind of local community of members. There's the numerary members, the celibates, but there's also the kind of the ordinary supernumerary members. These are kind of ordinary Catholics who are living, who are maybe married, live at home, have normal jobs. So the numeraries kind of run prayer groups and kind of spiritual guidance sessions for the kind of the local network of Opus Dei. Now, Opus Dei kind of likes to, it operates in a kind of very kind of arm's length mentality. So it likes to say that the local cells are just completely independent. These are, people in those cells have complete freedom to do whatever, and it's just a bunch of ordinary Catholics getting together to help each other out. But in reality, it's complete fiction. Rome issues, a continuous stream of edicts telling these kind of local centers how many people they should be recruiting and basically how to live their daily lives. So yeah.
So, as a journalist, you started out as a financial journalist, right? And then you started digging into Opus Dei. That seems like kind of quite a surprise as far as just a pivot in your work. Could you tell us a little bit about how you started working on that and like how you ended up writing this whole book about Opus Dei?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite right to call it a surprise because it was a surprise to me as well. So I never set out to write a book about Opus Dei. In fact, I knew next to nothing about Opus Dei when I set out on this project. So I fell into this story completely by accident. What happened was a bank in Spain collapsed, and I was sent to report on it as a financial reporter, as I had done numerous other times. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, I'd been sent all over Europe to cover all kinds of banking collapses. And at first, this just seemed to be like just the usual kind of run of the mill executives that allowed the bank to get out of control, and things had spiraled until it was uncontrollable, and then it just all collapsed. But the more I dug into the story, the less sense it seemed to make. And then I made this huge breakthrough. I met the former chairman of the bank, who had run this bank was called Banco Popular, who had run Popular alongside his brother for like close to 50 years. His brother had been a member of Opus Dei. The Opus Dei member, had died. And the younger brother basically told me how Opus Dei had hijacked this bank in the 1950s, in 1950s Spain. And since then, had used it basically as a cash machine to finance its growth around the world. So suddenly, what I thought was just this plain old banking story had transformed into this crazy tale of how Opus Dei had infiltrated this bank and then used it to siphon off hundreds of millions of dollars to expand around the world. And yeah, I just kind of kept digging and put together this incredible tale.
So, what were some of the other things that you kind of discovered in the course of this reporting?
So, I mean, I very quickly, tried to reach out to current members of Opus Dei and also former members of Opus Dei. And very quickly, I realized that there was this kind of hidden underbelly to the movement. So, Opus Dei, over the years, has very successfully kind of, I guess, projected an image of just, devout Catholics just kind of going about their own thing, kind of doing, striving to serve God through their everyday activities and just being a kind of great bunch of folk kind of kind of thing. But I soon discovered that there was, all kinds of a real kind of dark side to Opus Dei, especially among the numerary members. So many, and I spoke to more than 100 former members from across the world. So this is not kind of, these were not kind of bad apples or like one-off instances or restricted to one particular country or whatever. In general, allegations of spiritual abuse, of coercion, manipulation, the recruitment of children, the use of prescription drugs to control members and to hide, really quite acute mental illness in the ranks, which had, arguably been caused by the coercion and control structures that they were under. But also, I mean, kind of almost most horrifically, Opus Dei also had this underclass of members, which was basically this army of domestic servants, all of them women, almost all of them recruited whilst they were still girls, still children, normally in developing countries. So through my work researching the bank, I discovered that the bank had been financing this network of what they called, rather euphemistically, hospitality schools, where Opus Dei would go out into local villages in places like Argentina or the Philippines, Nigeria, and would find young girls from good Catholic families and would say to them, look, around here, you've got zero prospects. How about you come back to the big city with us and we'll train you in the world of hospitality. We'll teach you to cook and to serve. And it'll be a great way for you to, aspire to a better life, get qualifications and get a job in the hospitality industry. And these girls, and we're talking girls aged kind of 12, 13, 14 years old, once they were like hundreds of miles away from their families, they would be coerced and manipulated into joining Opus Dei, into these as these domestic servants, and many of them worked for decades, 365 days a year, 14 hours a day, not allowed to go onto the street on their own. Basically expected to serve the elite members of Opus Dei for zero pay whatsoever. And I discovered through my reporting that a bunch of them had risen up in Argentina and were demanding compensation. And the now federal prosecutors in Argentina have taken on the case, and they have leveled formal charges of human trafficking and serious labor abuses against Opus Dei. And we are set to see 4 Opus Dei priests, senior members of Opus Dei in Argentina, stand trial in coming months and years. But I know from my research that that's not a one-off instance. Opus Dei was running similar schools all across the globe, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe. And so I think this is possibly the next huge church scandal that we're about to see.
So I think if someone were kind of learning this information for the first time, all of it, anti-labor, an elitist organization, and now all of these revelations, that they would say, well, this doesn't sound like a Catholic group. This sounds like an anti-Catholic group. But when we ran John Farrell's review of your book, I managed social media, and I certainly saw some people rising up to defend Opus Dei. So I'm curious about. I'm seeing just the tip of the iceberg there. I'm curious about what kind of reaction you've gotten to your book.
Um, it's been mixed, let's say. um, no, I mean, look, there is absolutely no implication that every member of Opus Dei is kind of engaged in this kind of these horrendous acts. The point in my book is I think a lot of people have gotten good things from Opus Dei. Opus Dei has helped many people to become better Catholics, that's for sure. But it's also undeniable that the organization has deep, deep, deep problems. I mean, we've seen in recent days with events in Peru where the Pope has basically closed down what was until recently a widely respected Catholic organization there, that some of these organizations can spiral out of control. And many of the um, abuses leveled at the organization there in Peru is, are kind of common to Opus Dei as well. So I think a lot of members have fallen for the kind of PR that Opus Dei has very successfully spun to the world. But that does not negate the abuse and manipulation that happens at the core of the organization. And Pope Francis is very much aware of this. So he's taken a series of steps over the past few years to to effectively rein in the organization. I think the Pope is actually preparing for a full intervention in Opus Dei. We will see if and when that happens. But the Pope is treading very carefully. He knows that Opus Dei has a large membership, and he knows that the church, especially in countries like the US, is deeply divided. And I think he is aware that by going after Opus Dei, even if it's completely justified, he risks kind of creating an even wider schism within especially within the US church, but also in other countries as well. So I think he's very much aware that this is a very acute and serious problem for the church, and that he needs to address these abuses. He's very much aware of what's been going on. But I think he's taking kind of very delicate steps because he knows that Opus Dei has very vocal and very powerful membership, that and going after it too hard could very much backfire. And with what we're seeing against the sodalicio in Peru, that has taken 7 years to come to fruition. Like, I think the first major book that was written about that group came out in 2018, and we're only now seeing the closure of the group. So I think it could take some time, but this is very high on the Pope's agenda. Now, I think there are some people in Opus Dei who are hoping that Francis won't be able to follow through on his agenda of reforming Opus Dei or closing it down, that the next Pope perhaps will be more amenable to Opus Dei. But yeah, I guess we will see. This is a 2,000-year-old institution. The Catholic Church, I mean, Opus Dei is less than 100 years. Things don't always happen very quickly. So even if reform is coming, then it could take some months or years to happen.
Well, that's all our questions, Gareth. Thank you so much again for talking to us today.
Thank you guys for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Wow, that was quite a conversation. Our senior editor, Sarah, is going to join us now to unpack some of the stuff we learned.
Hi, guys.
Yeah, so that interview.
Yeah.
Wow. Was there anything that surprised you, which seems, I don't know, was there anything that didn't surprise me, maybe is the question, but yeah, like first impressions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still processing the bit about the allegations, which I obviously have heard about. But it's just really heavy, and every time I hear about it, it's just a good reminder that institutions can carry a mix of good intentions and also harm. And we have to always be cognizant of that. But I think the one thing that is like sticking with me besides that is the idea that Opus Dei is so intentionally like exclusive, especially in contrast to the church's mission to like welcome everyone. It just kind of throws me a bit. I want to know more about how that gatekeeping makes sense given the church's mission and especially a lot of work surrounding inclusivity and social justice.
So, I mean, I read John Farrell's review of Gareth's book before we did, I think we all read the review before we did the interview. So I was aware of some of this. And based on my experiences, I wasn't shocked because I did experience the group as being fairly secretive, seeking a particular type of personage that I clearly wasn't. I interacted with a lot of Opus Dei people in graduate school, and they tended to be quite conservative and to lean towards much more traditional interpretations of the church. So, actually, what surprised me was the idea that Opus Dei might have originally been intended to be more inclusive. So yeah, when I read on their website that they are trying to reach out to diverse demographics, I'm like, wow, that actually sounds really good. I can understand why that would appeal to a lot of people.
Yeah, it's this really beautiful vision of the church, right? People speaking in different languages who look different ways, all working together to build the kingdom of God. You read that and it is. It's this wonderful inclusive vision of what the church should be. And I think there's this good kind of reminder there that institutions are different from people. This is echoed in the church as a whole, right? Like the Catholic Church has been involved in some pretty horrific things throughout the years. And that doesn't mean that we throw the church away. I do think that people in glass houses can't throw stones, right? Like we're all members of this church that has participated in horrible things, and yet we still find beauty and truth and God in this institution. And so there's a balance there, right, between the people who make up an institution and then the institution itself.
Yeah, it almost feels like kind of a metaphor for this tension that we already have in the Catholic Church, and it's been a tension in other groups too, in that there's this pull towards following this kind of gospel call to which Pope Francis has repeatedly reflected, that the church is supposed to be here for everyone. And then this other impulse to make it into a kind of elitist group. And depending on where our experience lies, we may say to ourselves, well, yeah, I want to be a part of this and I want to be part of this work to bring it back to what it was intended to be. And then other people may say, this isn't for me. I can't be here anymore.
I also think that's a really good point to, again, making parallels with the whole church, right? That there are people that the church has really profoundly wounded, and you can't blame them when they walk away, any more than you can blame the people who say, no, I want to stay and make change within the church or the organization. That those are both valid reactions to the harm that these institutions can do. Yeah, so there was a lot in this interview. And was there anything that you wish we could have followed up on or asked for more information?
Yeah, I would like to know, this was more of a minor thing, but I would like to know more about Opus Dei's concentration in Washington D.C. Gareth mentioned it, but we didn't get into it, and it's interesting, and it makes me think about the kind of elitism that comes into play here, and also like whether there are, or what the real world implications are for policy and politics if that is the case.
Yeah, I know there's been a lot of speculation about various high profile conservative Catholics who are influencing policy right now, and whether they actually have Opus Dei membership. And, it almost starts to sound like a suspense thriller, like, are you in Opus Dei? And yet you probably run into people in your parishes or schools who are in Opus Dei and are just ordinary, normal people and aren't, secretly pulling the strings anywhere. But yeah, I would have liked to have gotten into that more as well.
It's hard to separate like the sensationalistness of, I mean, everything he was talking about, right? We're like, this is like a spy thriller. It just kept going. And it's not like, so there's that is sensational in and of itself and troubling and problematic. And then I think there's the fact that then, because the organization is so secretive, like it just kind of takes on additional like mythology, and you can't tell who's a member, what's truth. Like, are they engaged in backdoor politicking, right? Like it just kind of takes on this added speculation.
Yeah, and I mean the Da Vinci Code doesn't help. I know Rebecca hasn't read it somehow.
Yeah, I know I mean, I think a lot of people only know about Opus Dei through that story. And no, I didn't read it because I wanted to, because all the Catholics were like mad about it. And I always like to rush out and see whatever the forbidden book of the month is, but I couldn't get into it because the writing was really bad. But apparently, it also really misrepresented Opus Dei, like not just as in portraying them as sinister, but just getting the facts wildly wrong, like portraying there being monks in Opus Dei, and the man did not do his research.
I think my thing that I wish we had gotten more details on is he mentioned that Pope Francis has kind of changed the governance a little bit and brought it under closer control of the Vatican. And I wish we'd had time to kind of tease that out, like what that means and what that looks like and how that differs.
Yeah, that was intriguing because their governance is so different. It's hard to even write about them because you can't just be like, an order, an abbot.
Yeah, okay. So this is a tough question, but if you were going to give a sermon on Opus Dei, what would be the call to action?
Ooh, maybe not explicitly about Opus Dei, but someone was listening to the podcast. I I would want people to remember that blind faith in any institution can cause you to overlook injustice.
And I think the fact that, there are these women who had very terrible experiences and whose lives were really deeply harmed, that we, as long as we are in the church, and in fact, wherever we are, should always be looking towards those who no one is paying attention to. And here, I think I personally get easily distracted by the sensationalism and the Da Vinci Codeness of it all. And I think it's important to always come back to looking at those who have been subjected to injustice and asking ourselves what we can do to help them.
I think those are both really good points. I don't really have too much to add on the topic this time because I think this is a really hard topic. And I think we've all experienced being part of corrupt organizations, whether it's the Catholic Church or political institutions or smaller, more local ones. And I think this episode was a really good reminder that even the things that are really important to us and really meaningful to us, power corrupts.
And that's our show. Thanks again for joining us for Glad You Asked. If you enjoyed the episode, please tell your friends about the podcast, or leave us a review or a rating on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It helps more people find our podcast.
Do you have a question you'd like to hear answered on our show? Email us at editors@uscatholic.org. And please join us next week when we'll be discussing whether Adam and Eve were real.
Glad You Asked is sponsored by the Claretian Missionaries. The Claretian Summer Mission is for young men and women ages 18 to 30 who feel called to grow in their relationship with God. Inspired by St. Anthony Mary Claret, this experience will equip you for meaningful service while connecting you with a community of faith-driven young adults. Learn more and apply today at www.myclaret.org/Claretian Summer Mission.
Glad You Asked is hosted by me, Emily Sana, along with Rebecca Bratton-Weiss, with assistance by James Chung McKenna. We're produced by Sarah Butler-Schuler, with sound engineering by Nathaniel Hunter and art by Megan Avery.